Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. I'm Jackie Lynch, and I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. In this presentation, we're going to cover a number of tips on VIO servers and looking after them. And you should be able to download a copy of the handout at the link down the bottom, which is VIOS Top Tips-July 2024. Taking care of your VIO server should be a priority for you. This is the system that basically runs all of your client LPARs and servers. One of the key things is to stay current. That means upgrading regularly. I see VIO servers that have not been rebooted for 2 and 3 years sometimes. You will run into problems with that. So stay current, and that way you can do more regular, more simple VIO upgrades. I also install hyperfixes, and I also keep things like Java, SSH, SSL, Python, and the rest up to date. That's because I don't want to have security holes in my VIO servers. I'm a big fan of keeping things simple and documenting things really well. I personally used to hate documentation until I had to work on someone's system that was completely undocumented. And we're going to cover all of these topics as we go forward, including the dual DVIOs, some VIO commands for maintenance, some comments on backups. There will be a separate presentation later on actually doing a upgrade of a VIO server. So this is really to get you prepared and to keep you doing things in a consistent manner. So how do we get started? Well, the first thing you should do is download all the software and then read all the readmes. Because one of the things you want to make sure of is that everything that you're planning on updating will work with everything else at the levels that they're at. And I normally have an order for how I do my patching. I normally get my HMC patched first, then I'll do potentially the server firmware, although sometimes I do that later. I then do my NIM server. One of the reasons for that is that NIM has to be at the same level or higher as the highest level system. So if I want to have a VIO at 4.1.0.21, my NIM has to be at AIX 7.3.2.2. So I just update it first. Then I'll do my VIO servers and any IO firmware, and then I do my actual client LPARs, AIX, IBM, Linux, etc. However, sometimes you'll find in the readmes that you may have to do a different order because the IO firmware requires a minimum level of AIX and so on. And before I start, I actually pre-document all the steps I plan to take. And then I just tweak it as I go along. So as I said, the first recommendation is to stay current, and that doesn't mean just your VIO servers, as I just mentioned. And this slide actually is from the IBM website, and what it shows you is the different versions of your VIO server and what the recommended update is if you're on that particular level, when it was released, and the EOSPS date is this end of service pack support, and that will be the last updates that they will provide for that version. So when you see that something's gone EOSPS, what that means is if you call in a problem on it, you are highly likely to be told by IBM to upgrade it. So that's why it's a good thing to keep an eye on this particular page. In this presentation, I'm going to focus more on PowerVM version 4, which has been out since November 2023. And then in the upgrades presentation that I'll put together, I will cover doing the version 3 to version 4 upgrades themselves. So version 4 is basically the VIO server running AIX 7.3. And 41010 is the equivalent of 7321. And 41021, which is the most recent, is the equivalent of AIX 7322. 41010 adds a number of features. There's a lot of security enhancements, and they also updated the VIOS upgrade command to add some new device names and also to enhance VIOS BR, which does all your virtual backups. 4.1.0.21 again adds a lot of security enhancements. It also does more enhancements to VIOS upgrade and VIOS BR. The other thing that you should be aware of when you upgrade to version 4 is that there are a number of known issues about not being able to log in as PAdmin after the update. So in this slide and the one before, I put some links in there so that you can go and read up on that. And I also just published an article on upgrading to VIO Server 4. The links are on the very front page of the handout. I highly recommend that you go and read that because it will help you to avoid these little gotchas. So the main thing that you need to do the update to VIO Server 4 is download the install images, and those are actually downloaded from the entitled software site. They are not in Fix Central. So I have the links in here. I always download the latest flash image. What that does is it takes the two DVD images and it combines them onto one ISO, and that's the ISO that I will use for the upgrade. To go to 41021, you can upgrade from any level of version 3.1. If you're on 226, you have to get to 3.1 before you can patch to version 4. And I've got the links for the updates. You can also download the fix pack. If you're on version 410 already, you really just need the fix pack. And again, your NIM master needs to be at AIX 7322 in order to be able to do backups and restores for your VIO servers. And be aware that you have to be on Power 8 and above to be on version 4. Version 4 is not supported on any of the Power 7 models. So again, make sure that you read the READMEs, and there's also a very good red book for the servers that will actually help you know what VIO server levels you require as a minimum before you can install that server. I'm a huge fan of the Fix Level Recommendation tool, and so I wanted to point out all these links on this page that will help you make sure that you know the correct levels to be at and to use. What the Fix Level Recommendation tool will do is you plug in your current levels, it tells you what the updates are that need to be done. You can also use Flirt Lite to just check things like the levels of support and so on. And the VIO server to NIM master mapping is also very handy because that helps you figure out where you need to be. There's a number of other links here, but those are the ones that I go to all the time. Something else that a lot of people are very leery of is putting on hypers and other emergency fixes on their VIO servers. This is something that you really should be doing, so I'm going to talk about that for a couple of minutes. So once you install your VIO server, as part of the install, it's going to install Java, SSH, and SSL. And the ones that are in the base install already have security holes. So that's one of the things that you're going to have to patch. And the way to do that is you have to go download them. You get SSH and SSL from the web download pack. So again, not from Fix Central. And you get Java from Fix Central. And basically, I get the files downloaded, I put them all into the same directory after I untar them, and then I use Update iOS to actually do the updates. And the level of Java that you should be on once you're, I think it's 3.1.3 and above, is Java 8. And the latest level of Java 8 is 8.0.0.826. If you've still got some Java 7 in there, it should be at least at 7.0.0.715. And as of today, I've got the latest SSH and SSL levels. So those are the levels at a minimum you should be at. But if you run Flirt VC, once your VIO server is up, it will let you know whether or not there are additional patches beyond the ones we're going to talk about, because obviously these get updated all the time. One thing I have noticed for the VIO servers only is that for some reason a lot of the messages end up back level. So when you do your OS level -S, it looks like the system's back level. I remove all of the language sets except for the ones that I'm using, which is, in my case, English. And that way they don't stay back level because they're not on. So this is something you might want to think about. The other thing I do is when I actually create the directory that I'm going to install SSH from, I remove all of them from that directory so that I'm not even trying to update them. So e-fixes and iFixes are an important part of putting security patches on your VIO server and also on AIX. The way that you check for them is you download Flirt VC from IBM's Flirt website, and once you have it downloaded, you run it. It will need to be able to go outside to the IBM website, and it will let you know what patches you need, and it will give you the links to go and find those patches. Typically, they're found as tar files on the public.dhe.ibm.com website, so you can go and download them separately if you wish to. You can use eManager-L to list the installed efixes and ifixes, and I can tell you that by default, when you bring your VIO server up, it will have none. What I normally do is figure out what the fixes are that I need to put on. I put them in their own directory, and then I use Update iOS to actually install the patches out of that directory. Now, occasionally it doesn't install a fix that's in there. I've never figured out why. So occasionally you will need to go become root and use eManager to install them yourself. But you should always, first of all, try doing Update iOS and point it at the patches. So as of August 21st, 2024, there were 3 efixes and ifixes to go on VIO 4.1.0.21. There's one for Inventory Scout, one for curl, and one for OpenSSH. There were also some additional patches that I had to put on using install P or update iOS. There's fixes to RPM, to Inventory Scout itself before you put the patch on, to Python if it's installed, to Perl, and there were also a couple of others. There was a newer version of SSL that had to go on. And then whenever you do an update, particularly if you're touching RPM, you should always run the update VT package command as root. That will make sure that all of the links that are necessary are going to be in place. So a couple of other notes. You can get the links, all of the VIOS hypers at the link on this page. And then I've put down on here for you basically where you go to find all the ifixes, efixes, and the security patches. And if you run FlirtVC, it will provide you the direct link. The only thing it won't provide direct links for is Java, SSH, and SSL, because you get Java from Fix Central and you have to go to the web download to get the OpenSSH and OpenSSL. And sometimes before you do any updates, you need to remove an efix or an ifix because it has locked the code, and the way you do that is with the eManager -lowercase r -capital L and then the label of the efix, which you can get from the eManager -capital P or -L command. One of the things you should be aware of is you should have a plan for what happens if your upgrade goes south, because IBM's going to ask you for a snap or a perf PMR. They're going to ask you to SFTP files, those kind of things, and you need to know how to do that. You also need to have the ability to open cases online through their support portal. So when you get a new server, one of the first things you should do is go to the support portal and register the serial number so that you have access to open cases on it. You should also go and make sure that you have an SFTP transfer ID, because IBM now requires the use of SFTP with a specific transfer ID that will be assigned to you. So you need to make sure you have one. And you don't want to be doing this in an emergency. I always make sure I have the latest perf PMR for my OS versions downloaded, and I make sure I know how to run a snap, because IBM will ask you, before they'll look at any VIO and sometimes AIX problems, they'll ask you to run a snap and then upload it. So you may as well know how to do it. The other thing I make sure of is that my VIO is well documented so that I can provide all of the information that IBM is likely to ask for. These are the things that will make your life easier when you have a severity 1 or 2 problem and everybody around you is panicking. I'm a huge fan of keeping things simple and consistent. I don't like it when everything is set up differently on every different VIO and where people are doing things just because they can. Sometimes there are some really cool things you can do, but they will make your life very complicated in the long run. So just try to keep things as simple and consistent as possible. So here are a few just general kinds of tips. I mentioned keeping it simple. You want to make sure that the LMB, which is the logical memory block size, is the same on all your servers. Otherwise, you will not be able to use LPM between them. I always try to use the hot pluggable adapters rather than any built-in ones. What that means is that when I have a problem, I am able to remove that adapter and replace it without having to take the server down. And that kind of leads into setting up your adapters as desired, not required. And you should do that with the virtuals for the client LPARs as well. I never set any adapters up as required. I'm a big fan of dual VIO servers. If they're set up correctly and the zoning and everything is done correctly, it means that I can do my maintenance on my VIO servers, one VIO at a time. And all I have to do is make sure I monitor the paths on the production LPARs to make sure that I only lose half the paths when I'm rebooting one of the VIOs. And that is something when you set up a VIO you should test. You should actually shut down one of the VIOs, see what happens to the client LPARs, and then bring it back up, make sure all the paths come back, and then do it again on the other one. That way you know that all of the zoning has been done correctly. I never mix multipath drivers on HBAs. So if I have two different disk vendors, I try to put them on different HBAs. I also make a huge use of the HMC scanner tool. I run that before and after all changes, and sometimes I just run it randomly. And it's a great way to document your servers. The other tool that you can use is sysplan from the HMC. I quite often will do both. I plan for at least one update per year, preferably more. And when I say an update, I mean like an operating system, service pack, technology level or version update. I still do patching in between because I don't want a security hole sitting around in my VIO server for 6 to 12 months. You should have at least 2 VIO servers, but you can separate them and have more if you want to. So you could have 4, 2 for storage and 2 for the network. Some people separate them for production and non-production. I don't tend to do that. I prefer to have the production and non-production on the same VIO servers, but I make sure that if I'm using shared processor pool, that production LPARs have a much higher priority than any non-productions. And as I mentioned before, we really do want to test any kind of failover. So one of the things you should keep in mind is that wherever possible, you should use the VIO commands that run under padmin rather than going into OEM setup bin, becoming root and using SMIDI. Now, not all commands are available under padmin, so sometimes you will have to. For instance, I keep my root VG mirrored if it's on an internal disk, and those commands are run as root. But things like updating and so on should not be done as root unless everything else doesn't work. Whenever I configure a VIO server, it always has 2 disks, one for root VG and a second disk that is for cloning. I don't ever have a 2-disk root VG unless I have it mirrored. So just be aware that that second disk is to use for cloning or for mirroring. And even if you're on the SAN, you should still have that second disk in your VIO to use for cloning, but on a SAN you don't need to mirror root VG. I also have to fix the paging because for some reason I've seen it come with a 512 meg HD6 and a 1.5 gig paging 00 on the same LUN. You should never have 2 paging files on the same disk, so I basically remove paging 00 and make page HD6 bigger. If I plan to use file-backed optical, which I usually do to share ISO images, I do not put the repository in root VG. I add a 3rd disk that's appropriately sized and I set it up over there. And that's because I want to keep my root VG as small and clean as possible so that if I ever have to recover it, I can do it quickly. It also means that when I take a clone prior to updates, that clone runs a lot quicker. And then the dump devices won't be set up properly and there won't be any logging. So those are the things I go and set up. Now there is a program called PART, P-A-R-T, which was known as the VIOS Advisor, and I tend to run that quite regularly, particularly if I'm looking at performance, because that can give you some really useful information. Obviously I check ERRPT all the time, and I back up regularly, I actually take both types of makes SBs, the one for NIM, so that I can restore from NIM, and the one that is a pure makes SB. And one other thing to keep in mind is you should never run a VIO server, or actually really any LPAR, at consistently at or above 100% entitlement. If you do that, you are actually going to be affecting your performance, specifically your network performance, quite badly. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at how you're going to set up your configurations. I just mentioned the VIO server part command, which is run as padmin. So if you wanted to grab two 20-second snaps, then you would use the part command that I have below. And then you can also use part to actually analyze an nmon file that's already been recorded by giving it the name of the file. What part produces is an XML file, and you should be able to open it with a browser. However, recently I've noticed that the browsers I'm using, when I open the XML file, it basically just gives me all the XML text, and it doesn't actually configure it or set it up the way that it's supposed to be. So I found out that if I brought up my Linux LPAR, I could untar the file created by part, and then I did a little bit of editing on the XSL files, and then I ran this program called xsltproc to actually create me an HTML file that now has it all beautifully formatted, and I can look at that and get all the details that I want on how the VIO server's been performing. So I have a few notes on the upgrades, and I just recently published 2 articles at Tech Channel, one on HMC VIO tips and the other one is about upgrading to PowerVM version 4.10.21. And in both cases I came up against some interesting little gotchas. So there are a set of patches that are specific to VIO server version 3 that you should install before you do the upgrade. Otherwise, your VIO server account padmin will not be able to log in. And it's not just an expired password, you can't log in. The link that I've got there has the patches to avoid that problem. But there are some options on the HMC for some commands you can issue to basically recover it. So you don't have to panic and boot from your clone or anything. There are multiple ways around it, and I do document those in the articles. The other thing I found was that I had to run AutoVSBR no backup before the upgrade. Otherwise, when it tried to run the upgrade, it would come up with an error on the Perl script. For some reason, it doesn't want VIOSBR running backups, which is something that I do run all the time. If you get an error on the VIOS upgrade that starts with the LSFS stuff, you may have to delete any custom dump files. So I always create custom dump files so that I have dump files large enough to get a dump from IBM. When I ran my VIOS upgrade, it failed and it was complaining about this LSFS. So I simply set both my primary and secondary back to sysdumpdev null and HD6, and everything ran fine. After the upgrade, I recreated my dump devices. Something I just struck recently was when I was going from 4.10.10 to 4.10.21, and I had already been through the upgrade issues with my padmin account not being able to log in, and I'd fixed it and I'd told it to never expire, etc. As soon as I put the fixes on, my padmin account password got expired, and so if I tried to log in, and this is before the reboot, it would just say your password's expired, you have to change it. And it had also updated the rules in Etsy Security User, so it had some really complex set of rules. So what I ended up having to do was go into Etsy Security User, change the rules to what I was willing to work with, and then basically as padmin, because I hadn't logged out before I tested it, I changed the password and then changed it back. So that's something that you should be aware of, because the first time I found out after the reboot, and I was able to change the password, but I wanted to change it back, and that was where I figured out that they'd actually changed the rules. So just watch out for that. There seems to be some messing around going with the padmin account. I mentioned documentation several times, I've had the misfortune to have to work on systems that people have not documented and to try to recover them. There are multiple ways that you can document your VIO servers, and you will save yourself a world of grief if you've done that. And I tend to document right down to knowing what port each of the fiber ports, etc., is plugged into on the switch as well as on the server. And I use the HMC scanner extensively as well as sysplan to make sure I have more documentation than you really need. But what I've found is that there are times when one of them will find you an answer that the other can't, and it doesn't take long to do it. The kind of thing that I document is the equipment, the serial numbers, the customer number, because if I don't have that, I can't add that server to my support list when I open cases. The UAK expiration dates, because now we have these universal access keys where you won't be able to install firmware if your UAK is expired. I also document the HMC ASMI, HMC access, BMC credentials, etc. All of those usernames and passwords, you should know what those are and have them in a file somewhere safe. Because I have the HMC scanner, a lot of the other stuff's pretty simple for me, like server and IO server firmware levels. IO firmware levels I have to keep track of by LPAR. Typically, if you're using VIO servers, you only have to worry about the IO firmware levels on the VIO because everybody else is using virtualized VIO. But if you have LPARs like my NIM LPAR that also have dedicated adapters in them, keep track of those as well. And the rest of this is pretty common. IP addresses, resource profiles, adapter allocations. I have standards that I use for the network, vSCSI and NPIV, so that they're very, very consistent. I have a range for VIO1 and a range for VIO2. So when I look at a fiber adapter, for instance, on a virtual client, I can tell because it's 80 that it's VIO1, and if it's 180, it's VIO2, or whatever the standard is for that client. I also keep track of all the VFC hosts and their WWPNs. And one of the other things that you need to pay attention to that people don't is power needs and PDU mapping. One of the things that frustrates people is that you have to have more power available to you than you would actually use. And the reason for that is because of how redundancy works. So if you've got 30 amp PDUs, you can only use 4.98 kVA by electrical regulations on a 30 amp PDU. They basically let you use 24 of the amps. So you have to calculate how much amperage you actually need. But where you run into issues is people think that's across both PDUs. No, that is per PDU. And that's because if you have a power failure and one of the PDUs goes, everything will switch to that primary PDU. So you have to have enough amperage to run everything that is connected. And you don't have any control over how that's switching to whichever PDU works, apart from where you plug things. And I have seen cases where people have overcommitted the PDUs, and when a PDU or a circuit failed, some of the servers just randomly powered off. In one case, their IO draw powered off, and in the worst case, there was a small fire. So please pay attention to your power. I've mentioned the HMC scanner a couple of times. So on this page, you'll see the link to get the HMC scanner, and there's also a link that talks about it. It has different tabs for everything. So you can see on my HMC tab, it's telling me that my software's at 10.3.1051, and it gives me the build date as well. One of the things that started happening at version 10, prior to that, it used to actually give you the list of patches that were applied. And as you can see from the output on my lshmc-V command, I've got two fixes applied, MF71553 and MF71686, and those are not listed on the HMC scanner. The other things that it doesn't document are your BMC and PNOR levels, your IP address for the BMC, and any VMI IPs. You have to get those differently. One thing I will mention is that there is a portion of the HMC that does tell you the PNOR level, but it doesn't give you the BMC, and you need that as well. There are two main HMCs out now, the 7063 CR1 and the CR2, they actually have an additional piece of code called a BMC, which also has something called a PNOR. And what's really nice about those is they have their own IP. You can connect to them through the web, and you can bring up a console on the HMC so that when you're doing HMC maintenance, you can now monitor the HMC and see if it hangs rather than having to stand in front of it and watch the whole update. They actually have different code, even though we call it a BMC and PNOR. So on the CR1, you'll see something like IBM P8DTU, it ends 2020610. So that translates to PNOR 3.11. And that will show on the HMC tab in an HMC scanner. But it does not tell me the actual BMC level. The same with my CR2, it shows me this Mowgli that ends, in this case, 127. The only way you can actually see the BMC levels is to actually connect with HTTPS to the BMC. And that will give you both the BMC and PNOR. And they are downloaded from Fix Central under the Power Firmware option. So I've put in here the latest levels for you so that you have them. And these may change over time, so you should always check them at the Fix Central site. I mentioned using dual VIO a couple of times, so we'll go into why you want to do that. Dual VIO has several different uses. One of them is it allows you to use concurrent updates. So I can update one VIO and reboot it, and the other one takes over the environment during that time. The other thing that it does is if you lose a SAN switch or if you lose a network switch, you only lose that one VIO that's connected to its connections. This assumes that you've designed everything with 2 SAN switches and 2 network switches and you've architected everything correctly. On some of the older servers, it required a split back plane if you wanted to use internal disks on the servers. On the Power 10s, we've got NVMe. We don't need a split back plane, but we do need to make sure we have enough internal disks. So what the dual VIO gets you is great redundancy and flexibility, and it limits the downtime that you're going to have on LPARs when you're doing VIO server updates, because technically you should have no downtime for that. I mentioned using VIO commands for maintenance whenever possible. Updates such as a service pack or a technology level, you're going to use the update iOS command because it is a pure update. When you're doing an upgrade, which means going from one version to another, so more recently it'll be version 3 to version 4, you're going to use the VIOS upgrade command. Now be aware, if you use NIM, NIM has a VIOS upgrade command as well, but it has a different syntax. So what I'm talking about here is just doing the VIOS upgrade on the VIO server. And the way that that will work is it will take a clone to your second disk, and then it will do all the upgrading on the second disk. So to do an upgrade from version 3 to version 4, you have to have that second disk, and it needs to be the same size. If you want to update something like Java, SSH, and SSL, you put them in their own directory and you point update iOS at that directory and it will put them on. And I talked about efixes and ifixes earlier. You can use eManager to list the patches, and then you should use update iOS to install or remove the patches, and only resort to eManager to install a patch if update iOS refuses to do it. I've had a couple of instances where that happened and we couldn't find a way around it, so I had to resort to eManager. So one of the things that your security department won't like is that everybody that uses the VIO server logs on as p-admin, so there is no individual accountability. Plus, if somebody messes up the p-admin password, nobody can get on. What I always do is I create a backup p-admin account, and in fact you should really create one for each user, hopefully there aren't that many, who will have access and need to be able to perform p-admin activities. So in my case, I just create a user called JLynch, and I set its password, and then I look at the roles that pAdmin and CacheADM have, and then I change my user to have those roles. If I then log in as Jay Lynch, I basically will behave like padmin. The one step that I forgot to put in here is you do want to copy the padmin.profile into the new account you created so that it has all the aliases set up for the commands. But I highly recommend doing this. I've done it for most of the servers I use, and it makes the security people happy because you can tell them that padmin is only used in emergencies, just like root should be, and everybody logs on as themselves. If you log on to your VIO server and become root and run LSM code space -A, it will give you the server firmware level, and it will also give you all of the IO firmware levels. When you document your system, it's important that you don't just document that you have a 2-port fiber channel adapter, but that you actually know the feature code that was ordered. Because when you go to put patches on or updates to your IO firmware, you will download them by feature code. And feature codes are things like EN1J, EN1K, and so on. And the same for the disks, by the way. So you can download the IO firmware updates from Fix Central. They're under Power IO. And basically you change them into the directory. And so as an example, for an EN1B fiber adapter, I might see something that ends .aix.rpm. So you have to unpack that using the rpm command, and then you can install it using diag. Now, sometimes you'll be doing a multi-port adapter, and so when you do the diag against FCS0, it will also do FCS0, 1, 2, and 3, and sometimes it won't. So you do have to pay attention to which ones it updated. And you can just run LSM code space -A after you've done that update to check that it went on. I found sometimes with the network adapters that are in a shared Ethernet adapter that it doesn't show me the new firmware level until I reboot. So just be aware of that when you're doing these multi-port adapters. Server firmware also needs to be updated, and as of March, this was IBM's latest firmware plan schedule. And firmware updates are downloaded from Fix Central. You do need to make sure that when you actually download firmware and go to install it, that you have an active universal access key, because it won't let the firmware go on if you don't. Also be aware that if firmware has been archived, that typically means it's out of support, and you run the risk, if you stay on that level, of being told that you have to update your firmware. And then one last thing is you need to do cross checks to make sure that the HMC will support that level of firmware. So that's why I typically do my firmware update after I do my HMC update, because there have been times in the past where the firmware required a certain level of the HMC, and if you weren't on it, you could actually corrupt your service processor. So please make sure that you read the README for the server firmware and for the HMC to make sure that you are doing them in the correct order. One of the other things you need to make sure you do is to back up your VIO servers regularly. I see a lot of times when people remember to back up all their AIXL paths, but they forget about the VIO servers and they forget about the HMC. And if you don't have those two, your client L paths aren't going to be doing very much. So there's a couple of different kinds of backups that I do with my VIOs. The first one is, before I do any kind of maintenance, I will use Alt Disk Copy to take a clone of my active root VG to the second disk. That way, if I have an issue during the upgrade, my recovery is to simply point the boot list to the clone disk, which in this case would be HDisk1, and reboot. Now, if you're on internal disk, you're going to be mirroring root VG. So if you've got a mirrored root VG, you'll need to unmirror it and fix the boot list, etc., before you do the copy, because that disk will be busy otherwise. The other thing I do is I take a MakeSysB backup to my NIM server as my absolute emergency backup. And by the way, I actually have my system set up to take a MakeSysB backup at least twice a month. So you might want to think about doing that. You could just run it out of Crontab. Something else that I've been seeing a lot of lately is VIO servers that have not been rebooted for a long time. I think the longest one I saw was over 1,000 days. And that brings up a lot of issues because there were definitely some bugs. If you hadn't rebooted, I think it was 740 days, it might not reboot. So it's really important that you reboot your VIO servers regularly. My rule of thumb is at least every 6 months, preferably every 3 months. The last thing that you want to do is reboot a VIO server and find that it doesn't boot. Try to go back to your backup and find out that you've been running a monthly backup for the last 12 months, but you only keep the last 3. And so you don't have a good backup because it got broken 6 months ago. So if you've got dual VIO servers, which you should, and they're properly redundant, you should be able to reboot your VIOs every 3 or 6 months. I just recommend that you do it before your backups cycle out. Anytime I'm going to do a reboot of a VIO or any AIX LPAR, I always run boss boot and I rewrite the boot list. I've been burned so many times by corrupt boot lists. But if you run a boss boot, you at least know that you have a good boot image. So those are all things to think about. And when I go to work on a VIO server or any AIX LPAR, if it's been a long time before it's been rebooted, I check ERRPT, I then rewrite the boot list, and do a boss boot, and I reboot it before I change anything. That way I know that it's going to come back. Because the last thing you want to do is reboot something that hasn't been rebooted for 700 and something days and find out that it won't boot. I'm a big believer in making sure that whatever I'm changing was working beforehand and is still working afterwards. This slide lists the supported methods for backing up and restoring VIO servers. One thing that's really strange is you can back up and restore AIX from a USB key, but you cannot back up and restore the VIO server from a USB key, although you can install a VIO server from the USB key that has the ISO burned to it properly. So it's very strange, but basically you can't use a USB key to back up and restore your VIO server. These are the only supported methods. So I back up to my NIM server. The backup script that I run out of cron tab, yours may vary. What this does, I always unmount the file-backed optical library if I have one, and I do that because there were some bugs where it would actually back up the media library even when you told it not to with the no media lib, and that would make for a really large MakeSysB image. So I stopped doing that. And the other thing I did to avoid that problem as well was I moved my media library out of RootVG and into its own volume group. So I basically tell it to become padmin and use backup iOS to do a backup, and that first backup is what I would call the NIM backup, and I can actually put that on my HMC if I need to do a restore. The second backup is a pure MakeSysB backup. I take both. That's just personal preference. You can figure out which one that you actually prefer. And then I also, at the same time, will grab an HMC scanner report. Something else I want to point out, because I keep seeing it, is if you have NFS mounts, please don't set them to mount equals true in Etsy file systems. Because what happens is they will then try to mount when rc.nfs runs, which is set to a 2-column wait in a init tab, which means if that server isn't available for you to do the mount from, your LPAR is going to have to time out, and that timeout can take a long time. And if you have several NFS mounts, you might be waiting a long time to reboot. So what I do is I have a line at the bottom of a init tab that's a 2-column once, where I run something called /etc/rc.local, and if something has to be mounted at boot time, I put it in there. So that's just a little tip for AIX, and I put it in here on the VIOs because I do mount my software and backups directories from my NIM server, although I don't have those mounted as true ever anywhere. Just something to think about. Earlier I had mentioned turning off the automatic VIO SBR backups. So I have a cron entry that every day it backs up my virtual IO virtual definitions, and it backs them up to /home/padmin/config backups. And I just have it keep the last 7 copies. And then I can use VIO SBR to view them, so I can figure out if somebody made a change or whatever. That's the one that you have to run the VIO SBR-no backup to stop it causing any VIO server upgrade to fail when you're ready to do the upgrade. And they're very, very useful. Recently, we had a Power 7 system that I had to regress from 3.13 to 3.12 because 3.13 is not supported on it, even though it works. And I had taken a VIO SBR backup, reinstalled 3.12.60, and then just restored the VIO SBR backup. And I didn't think it would work to a lower level, but it actually worked just fine. So that's something you want to think about. You're way beyond HMC 950 at this point, and you're on version 10. But there were some cool new things that came in at 950 that are obviously still available on version 10. And one of them is the ability to do that virtual IO backup and store it at the HMC and restore it from the HMC. And you can also back up your VIO server to the HMC and later on restore from the HMC. So the one thing you need to know is to run HMC 950, you have to be on the new power HMCs, the 7063 CR1 or CR2, but it also did run on a 7042 CR9. And as I said earlier, version 10 does not support any Power 7 servers. And version 10 will not run on your Intel like 7042 HMCs. Version 10 has some very cool features as well. One of the features that were added early on was the ability to validate and prepare your VIO server for maintenance. So you can actually check that all your storage and networking, etc., is in place and properly provisioned before you do the actual upgrade, so you know that you're safe to reboot that one VIO while the other one runs everything. And there's a couple of blogs here that you should find very useful. I'm going to touch on a few HMC commands here, even though we're really supposed to be talking about VIO servers, simply because it's important to know about some of the new commands which do impact your VIO servers, one of which is the ability from the HMC to control your backup images for your VIOs. What this slide is showing you is the output of the LSHMC-V and the -b, which get you what your HMC version is, what patches are on it, and then down the bottom it's giving me my PNOR level. And there's a list of HMC commands that you should find quite useful. The specific ones I use all the time are the lssysconfig-r lpar with the OS refresh. What that does is it goes and double checks that what the operating system level is and updates it in the HMC in case it didn't notice that it changed. And the lssyscon-r all will actually show you the VMI interfaces for any Power 10s that you have. So that's also another useful command. So there have been some updates to backup iOS on the VIO, and there are 3 flags that you should find particularly useful. They've been around for a while. One is the -makesysb, which just says create me just a pure makesysb image that I can use to restore. The -no media lib, which tells it not to back up that media library so that you can have a smaller makesysb. And the -no svg, which tells it not to worry about backing up the structures for any user-defined volume groups. Just back up the root VG and don't worry about other volume groups recording what they were. I mentioned earlier that you can now back up your virtuals to the HMC as well as the VIO server to the HMC, and you can restore from there as well. The other thing that you can do that I didn't mention was that you could actually import or export those backups to and from an external server using NFS or SFTP. And the thing a lot of people like, I tend to be a command line person, but a lot of people like the fact that you can use the GUI to do these backups. So you can actually manage and restore and back up your VIO servers using the GUI, or you can do it command line. And we're going to talk about that next. So on this slide, I list a number of new commands that came out in version 10 for controlling backups. So you can list the VIO backups that are stored in the HMC. You can create an IO config backup. You can also do a regular VIO server backup. You can rename a file. You can import, export them, as I mentioned, and you can restore them. So these are all commands that you should become familiar with, or at least become familiar with the GUI version of them, so that you know how to do it from an HMC if you want to. Just be aware, there's not a lot of space on that HMC. I think best case you'll have about 15 gig available to you. So don't assume that you're going to be able to put a lot of these up there. That's one of the reasons I like using my NIM server for this, because I can control the space there. And again, for install images as opposed to backup images, there's a number of new commands where you can list the install images on the HMC. You can change the name of them, you can delete them, and all of this you can do through the GUI as well. And I just wanted you to be aware. And in this case, I can actually load them into the HMC using SSH keys for authentication from my NIM server. So you have a number of different things that you can actually try with your HMC. One of the key things you need to think about is how you're going to size the VIO server in terms of CPU and memory. And it's really important to give that VIO server plenty of resources. You don't ever want to starve your VIO server because it is your most loved one. It is going to be supporting all of your client LPARs, and if it's not happy, they will not be happy. I always give my VIO servers the highest weight. Typically, I give them 254 if they're in the shared processor pool. More recently, I've actually been running them as dedicated to guarantee them that they'll have enough. But you need to make sure they have enough entitlement than what they would need on average. And that's because if they go above entitlement regularly, it actually impacts the performance on the shared Ethernet adapter because it scales by entitlement, not by virtual processors. So you want to make sure that your VIO servers very rarely go above entitlement. I usually give my VIO servers between 10 and 12 gig, depending on how many clients they have. You want to make sure there's plenty of memory. You do not want your VIO server to ever page. And I also tend to tune my virtual buffers and my HBA settings, and then I monitor it with nmon and the part command. So this is an example of a tuning script that I would use that basically does some network settings because the defaults they're set to aren't good. And it also changes my fiber adapters, changes num command alums and the transfer size. You should test all of these first, and if you want to make particularly the fiber adapters any larger, you should check with your disk vendor to make sure that they will support those values. I also tend to tune my network buffers on all of my virtual adapters, and I do it at the VIOs and I do it at my clients, and that's to make sure that I don't run out of virtual buffers for the networking, which will impact my performance. If you don't use a lot of networking, then you're probably fine, but I tend to tune them so that I avoid problems in advance. You can also use the VIOS rules command. That will let you tune the buffers there. I've got an article at Tech Channel on that, and there's also a link to the IBM Power Best Practices, which talks about this. Mentioned HBA tuning. One of the key things to remember is when you're tuning the HBAs, the VIO server must be set at least as high as the clients, otherwise they won't boot. So whatever number you pick for your VIO server, you must be the same as or less than that on your client LPARs. So num command alums, which I was talking about on the previous slide, is basically the equivalent of Q depth for a fiber adapter. There's also something called max transfer size, which is the IODMA size. The default was 0x100000, which was 16 meg. And then after that, the link ones that I have there basically get you 128 meg. And then there's an even larger one where it checks for the bus type, and you could get 256 meg, or it may just limit you at 128 depending on the bus. There are other adapters that can go even bigger. I bring this up because if you're driving really large IOs, then you may need to change this, but typically I use that 0x2 setting because that gets me a 128 meg DMA, and that tends to be enough for most users. And again, you want to make sure that the VIO servers are set to the highest level or same as your clients. Performance monitoring for your VIO server. You can use the regular AIX commands like vmstat, iostat. You can use the new part command that runs as padmin. And of course, you can always run nmon and run it in recording mode to gather information. There's also a new VIO stat command that will give you CPU and asynchronous IO and a few other statistics for your actual VIO server. So these are all things that you should experiment with and figure out what it is you need to be able to provide the performance information to management. So the next few slides are basically examples from the VIO stat command. This is the VIO stat-sys, so you can see it gives me some CPU information, some networking information, and a little bit of disk information. You can also ask it to give me adapter information, and for each adapter it will show me what disks are attached, and it will give me overall adapter throughput for that adapter. I don't recommend doing this on a system that has hundreds of disks because you're going to get a very long list under each adapter. By the way, that VIO stat-adapter actually gets you information for your VFC hosts as well, so you can see what their throughput is. The one thing I would mention about the VIO stat command, as with any command that ends stat, you need to take a couple of iterations because the first one is going to be the average since boot, and then the next one after that will be the average for the interval that you choose. I'm going to very quickly touch on some things around storage zoning and mapping because these have a big impact on your VIO servers and on LPM. When I talk about zoning, I'm talking about configuring the switch to allow that switch port to talk to the storage and also to the WWPN for the LPAR or server. So zoning is something that is done at the switch. The other thing we talk about is mapping, which is sometimes called masking. So that's when you're on the storage system. It could be a disk or a tape library or a virtual tape, and you update it to allow the host WWPN's access to the specific LUNs that you've provisioned. You have to provision the LUNs at the storage, and then you have to map them, and then you have to zone them at the switch before they can be used in an LPAR. And the same applies with VTL tape drives and other tape drives. So if we're direct attaching, we simply zone and map the WWNs, which are the ones that are on the real adapters. But if you're using NPIV, then we have to use the WWPNs on the virtual adapters, and we create those when we create the virtual fiber connections for the specific LPAR on the HMC. You can tell the difference, like a WWN, which is for the real adapter, tend to start with a 10 or 20, and the virtual ones, the WWPNs, tend to start with C0. If you get an HMC scanner report, you can see them. You can also log into the LPAR or VIO and get them there, or you can actually look at the LPAR under the HMC. The other thing you want to make sure of is that the connections to the switch are NPIV enabled if you plan to use NPIV. So if you run LSN ports as padmin, it will give you a list of the fiber adapter ports that are actually able to use NPIV. If you want to use LPM to migrate LPARs from one server to another, then it's important that you do the correct zoning and mapping. And don't confuse the two. So in order for LPM to work, when you create an LPAR and you create a virtual fiber adapter, it actually gets assigned two WWPNs. The first one is the default one that it uses normally, and the second one is used by LPM. It normally doesn't log in unless LPM's been used. They both have to be zoned and mapped. And the storage guys don't tend to like zoning and mapping them because if they map the LPM one and it's not being used, it shows up as not being active, and that upsets them. But if you don't map them at the storage and you do an LPM, you're going to damage your boot image. So you want to be very careful that they are correctly zoned and mapped. And one of the things I suggest people do is the very first time they want to do an LPM and they haven't tested it, do an inactive LPM. Shut the LPAR down, then migrate it, and then boot it. If you do it that way, you won't corrupt your boot image if someone hasn't done the zoning correctly. As I mentioned previously, every virtual fiber adapter for an LPAR has two WWPNs. The first one being the default, the second one being what I call the LPM one, which doesn't log in unless LPM is being used. So there's actually an order to how this works. Before you do an LPM the first time, the LPAR will be using the default WWPN, and that is what will be logging in to the switch, etc. After you do an LPM, you'll notice that the second WWPN is being used and the first one is not. And then if you do another LPM back, it goes back to that default WWPN. It flip-flops between them. However, if you do an inactive LPM, which is where you shut the LPAR down and then migrate it, shut down, and then bring it up, it does not flip-flop the WWPNs. It uses the same one that it used on the other server. One of the things you may see in your error report is errors on fiber cards, and when you look at them, it's actually a network card. That's because some of the 4-port 10 gig, 1 gig cards can act as network cards, but they can also do fiber channel over Ethernet, and so they define both a 10 gig port and a fiber channel port on the same port. And you can see that in the top where I've got FCS 0 and 1 are actually 8 gig ports, but FCS 4 and 5 are the 10 gig network port. And you get all these errors that come up, and they're quite annoying. So the way to correct this is first you make sure that those ports are not being used as fiber ports. They can be being used as the network, and you won't cause any problems. And then basically you unconfigure the two ports that are FCOE and are not being used. And from then on, you shouldn't see any errors in the error log for those ports. So one of the things I've talked about the advantages of is having that second disk. Obviously, on internal disks, I want you to use that second disk to mirror everything so that if a disk fails, you can still stay up. When you're on the SAN, you don't have to worry about using it for mirroring, but you should still have the disk for the second reason I do it, and that is because I want to use it for any kind of patching that I do. I want to take a clone to it, and then I can do my patching either on the live or on the clone. And of course, if I want to do a version upgrade, that second disk is required. I like to keep my root VG small and clean, but I do tend to give them 150 gig LUNs if they're on the SAN. So just something else to keep in mind. Figure out what your size is going to be if you're doing them through the SAN. I like having internal disks because if I have a SAN problem, I can still boot the VIO, and then if I can do debugging from there. If the boot disks for the VIO are on the SAN and there's a SAN problem, I'm not booting my VIO. So you can see here on this VIO server, I have 4 disks. I have my root VG, I have my alt inst root VG, which is my clone. FBO VG is where I happen to have put the repository, and that 4th disk is because I'm supposed to be mirroring FBO VG to that disk because it's an internal disk and could fail, but I haven't got around to it yet. And then there's also an lspv-size command, which will actually give you the size of the disks. If you're running as root, you can actually use the lsmpio command, and you do a -ql space hdisk0, and it will give you information about that disk, including the size of the disk. One of the things that's very challenging when you're doing debugging is if the time sync is not the same on all the LPARs and the VIO servers, and you're starting to have to do math to try to figure out when things happened. And the way around this is to use NTP. So you can talk to your network people and find out if you have an NTP server in-house. And if you do, then you should replace the 0.pool.ntp.org with the correct IP address. To set up NTP on AIX, that's done in /etc/ntp.conf. To set it up on the VIO server, you update the home padmin config ntp.conf, and basically you're just putting in the server name or IPs. If NTP is not running and the time is out of sync, you can then use the NTP date command as root to actually make sure that it now syncs with that. And then on VIO servers, I typically reboot them after commenting out this line that you see in rc.tcp/ip. So xntpd should be uncommented, and it should be for AIX as well. Then I typically reboot to make sure that it starts properly. The final tip is actually on updating your IO firmware, which a lot of people forget to do. So just as with server firmware, you run the LSM code -A on the VIO server or on any AIX LPAR that has direct attached devices. If you're updating the primary VIO and you want to work on the SAN adapter, on the network adapter, you can use the chdev command to put it into standby so the other VIO takes over and runs the network. Or you can just let it keep running. And then change into the directory where you downloaded the adapter code, use the RPM command to unpack the RPM. That puts it in /etc/microcode, and then use the diag -T download to actually start using that particular piece of code. In my case, this was a 4-port adapter, and I only had to run it once, and it updated all 4 adapters. Sometimes in order to do this, if you're using an SCA, if the patch doesn't go on or it gives you an error, you may have to unconfigure the SCA to do that. If you have to unconfigure the SCA to do it, you typically have to down it, then detach it, and then just rmdev the ENT. And if the IP's on the real, that's when you'll run into it. You then run config manager, make sure that the microcode went on and the SCA came back, and get into SMIDI TCP/IP and check if the IP is on. So obviously before you start, you're going to run an ifconfig -A and go into SMIDI TCP/IP and document all those network settings just in case they don't come back properly. So I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this, and I'm hoping that you find it useful. There will be a copy of the presentation uploaded to my website, and I also gave you the link to the articles that I've been writing for Tech Channel. There are a number of other authors there, like Rob McNally, who also write a lot of very useful content. So I highly recommend that you follow Tech Channel. Again, thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.